According to a foreign media report, around 24 teachers, counselors, and administrators at UNRWA schools in Gaza are members of Hamas or other terrorist groups. UNRWA, which is the United Nations agency responsible for aid to Palestinians. UNRWA is the same group which has been financially supported in the past by both Canada and the United States. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our foreign affairs expert and host of the Foreign Desk, Lisa Daftari, who joins us once again from Los Angeles. Lisa, the New York Times says one UNRWA educator could be seen quite regularly after hours in Hamas fatigues carrying weapons.
And this is the New York Times finally acknowledging what many other reports have indicated over the last year or so since the October 7th attacks. And we've known this all along. Even a decade ago, I remember working on stories really exposing UNRWA for who they are. They are entrusted with, as you correctly said, they are an arm of the United Nations entrusted with taking taxpayer money and advocating for and helping the Palestinian cause. Now, what have they done? In addition to what they believe is helping the Palestinian cause, they've put weapons in schools and they have put weapons in nursery schools. And in this case, we now know that they were heavily involved in terrorism, in actually participating in the October 7th attacks. Think about that. These are people who are either peacekeepers or supposed to be aid workers, employed by the United Nations and actually moonlighting as terrorists. It's a horrific thing. And finally, when the New York Times comes around to it and acknowledges it, then you know it's really bad. But what will be done? That's the question. Donald Trump, before he even thought of running for the office of presidency the first time around, I remember him going on the morning talk shows and talking about pulling American taxpayer money and funding from the acronymed organizations that do nothing, or in this case, they pay for the pay-to-slave program. And for those who are not familiar, it's when the Palestinians give money to terrorist families who are willing to die in the line of jihad, in the line of terrorism. So here we have it. It's there. The report is there. The facts are there. What will we do about it going forward?
Lisa, the United States plans to continue with its mission against the Islamic State in Syria, despite the recent capture of Damascus by those who are opposed to Bashar al-Assad's regime. Many are concerned that the chaos in Syria could give ISIS the ability to once again become active.
Absolutely, and that is what will happen. I know this is a very nuanced situation, what's going on in Syria right now. Some people celebrating and others are saying, well, let that celebration be tempered because what we're doing is giving from one terror organization to another. Just to break it down a bit, what's going on right now is that the Bashar al-Assad regime was toppled. That regime was propped up by the Islamic Republic, the regime inside Iran. We don't want them having any more appendages in the Middle East. Now remember, they're funding Hamas, they're funding Hezbollah, they're funding the Houthis in Yemen, they're funding insurgencies in Iraq, and of course Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. But one by one, these terror proxies and these insurgencies are being foiled. So we saw Hamas, obviously, and Hezbollah take a hit from the war that Israel is conducting against them. And now, of course, Bashar al-Assad's regime crumbling. So it gives Iran's regime one less foothold in the Middle East, which is a wonderful thing. And I know Bashar al-Assad is a horrific dictator, so people are truly celebrating decades, after decades of suffering under this dictator. The prisons have been opened, people who are political prisoners being freed, statues being toppled. So I understand why this is the celebration for many Syrians. Now, who's coming in? They are no angels, right? So of course, it's another terror organization. We're dealing with a political vacuum in the Middle East. And what happens to political vacuums in the Middle East? They always get taken up by terrorists. And that is why the United States and others, and of course, Israel has kept an eye on this around the clock to watch as to how things unfold on the ground inside Syria. Let Bashar al-Assad's regime go, and then we'll see what will unfold next and deal with that threat next. Now, the terrorists who are there now do have ties to ISIS. They do have ties to al-Qaeda. They are an offshoot of those groups. And therefore, we will have to see how things pan out there. But it's not exactly, the next best, next chapter of Syria's story that is unfolding here. This will be something that will have to take shape over time.
Now, Bashar al-Assad fled to Moscow and received asylum from his longtime ally just hours after the rebel group took control of Damascus, ending his family's 50-year reign.
Yes. And so, Hal, I'm not sure if you were watching what was going on social media. Many reports thought that there was actually a plane crash and he could have died in the plane crash. And wouldn't that make for a very dramatic ending to his dictatorship? But it is now confirmed that he is with his family safely in Moscow. The Russians, who have helped prop up Bashar al-Assad's regime in conjunction with the Islamic Republic, have offered him asylum there, and he will be living there safely, it seems, for now. Again, he represents a lot of years of pain and suffering for a lot of Syrian people, so that they don't like to see that this is how his story ends. But for now, the Russians will be protecting him.
Lisa, as we just mentioned, Russia has been in close partners with the al-Assad regime for decades and has gone so far as to lease strategic naval bases on the Syrian coast. Now, with al-Assad being ousted from power, how will this really impact Russia's military footprint moving forward?
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult for Russia to focus its energies and resources where Bashar al-Assad's regime is no longer. This is an interesting uh, kind of evolution of this war. If people recall, the reason the Russians have a larger responsibility in Syria is because of the Obama administration. If you remember the red line that was drawn, if that rings a bell, over a decade ago, the red line was drawn by the Obama administration, who said, if we find out that chemical weapons were used by the Bashar al-Assad regime, well then, they were used, and nothing happened. But what ended up happening is that the Obama administration entrusted the Russians to come in and oversee the situation and to monitor whether or not chemical weapons were used. Well, what do they say, the hen watching the fox? I don't remember the adage, but something like that. And that's why we see Russia getting a bigger role and getting more access to not only the Bashar al-Assad regime, but to weapons depots. And we literally gave them that role and we brought them into play. So it's going to be very hard for them to hold on to that. But who knows what's going to happen once January 20th rolls around. I want to remind everyone, when inauguration happens here, I think we're going to see a very different world order. We're going to see, I think, something of an off ramp for Putin with regards to the war in Ukraine. I believe we're going to see, a lot of different things happening on with the Middle East, with the war going on with Israel and the Palestinians. And I do think that as a result, Russia and China and Iran's regime will have to recalibrate what they're doing in terms of their extracurricular activities, what they're doing in terms of their expansion, what goals they have for themselves, and how they want to play along with the new Trump administration.
Speaking of which, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has called for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine, Lisa. Trump has also said that he would be open to reducing military aid to Ukraine and potentially pulling the United States out of NATO. Two threats which have alarmed officials in Ukraine.
Right. And then in the last 24 hours, the Biden administration doubled down, giving more weapons to Ukraine in the final hours. So, it's a crazy game. But what we are seeing is world leaders responding to the deterrence that Donald Trump is bringing in with him to the White House, and he's not even in the White House yet. What we are seeing is that world leaders are stepping up to meet with him. We saw Justin Trudeau, there was the president of Mexico, we saw Zelensky, we've seen, France. It seems as though people are responding. They want to at least have the conversation, which is very, very important. When he's calling for a ceasefire in between Russia and Ukraine, I think both parties are actually on board if it does mean something that is meaningful for both. And if they can come to that consensus, and I do think that Donald Trump is the man who can get that deal done and can understand both sides without making empty promises or empty threats. And in this case, I think both those threats that you mentioned, Hal, are credible threats. I think this is something that Trump would do in order to make his point heard and to make the world understand that there's a new sheriff in town, and the United States will wait to get what it is owed in terms of just compensation and collaboration, and if other nations need to pull their own weight. He's going to call on Russia, he's going to call on China, he's going to call on Iran's regime, and obviously work together with Zelensky to get something done.
Let's circle back to some of the threats here for just a moment, Lisa, and let's talk about the 25% tariff on Canadian goods and Mexican goods as well that Trump has threatened. Do you think he'd actually follow through with that, or is this just the first salvo in negotiations? After all, he is a businessman.
He is a businessman. So if you're asking me, would he, if he had to, he would. But I think that he is banking on the fact that the Canadians and the Mexicans don't have the appetite. Nobody does. But they certainly don't have the appetite. And as we've already seen, based on the pre-inauguration meetings between Canada and the United States, and again, rather Donald Trump and the Mexican president, there has been a reaction for both the Mexicans and the Canadians to say, we're going to control our borders. Look, everybody wins, Hal. Why not control the borders and not get the 25% tariff? I don't know. I mean, if Justin Trudeau's political ties or, his ideology, or whether it's the Mexican president's ideology, are so far left that they'd rather leave an open border, have more terrorism, more drugs, more crime, and more tariffs, doesn't really make sense for anybody, regardless of their political leanings. So I do think that this is a good entry point. I think, when we talk about safe borders, we've seen a lot of increased activity at our northern border with Canada, with you guys. I know that, everybody is looking for, and, the referendums that we're seeing all around the world, if you look at the elections that are moving further and further to the right, most of it is because of immigration, borders, crime, and the economy. And those are all things that Donald Trump is very much fixated on working towards, but in conjunction with a world, global order. I don't think he would leave Canada or Mexico out in the dust. I think it's that if we're going to do this together, we need you to be on board. So there will be consequences, there will be threats, but hopefully he won't have to act on those.
Lisa, following accusations of Russian meddling, Romania's top court annulled an ongoing presidential election, and officials say the entire process is going to have to be rerun.
Yes, and what's really interesting, Hal, in addition to this, just side by side, they have ordered TikTok to record any sort of activity that has to pertain to this election, to review, to record, to see if there's, what kind of interference there is. We are living in such a crazy time when, TikTok is questioned, and the interference there's so much interference in just, an election in Romania. So yes, it's being recalled. They'll have to start over again, and hopefully this time, maybe they'll have to call in Elon Musk.
And word is South Korea's President Yoon will resign from office, Lisa, despite the failure to impeach him. This after he inappropriately declared martial law the previous week, according to the leader of his political party.
Yes, they were not able to impeach him formally, but it seems as though there's so much egg on his face. He will not be able to continue and will have to just resign because of the political pressure. Look, 6 hours and he's done, right? 6 hours of martial law, and his constituents and others believing that this was a paragraph that went way too far. He, on the other hand, defending himself by saying that he was trying to stop pro-North Korean factions in the country from gaining momentum, and he had to do that as a last resort. But now he will be resigning.
She's our foreign affairs expert and host of the Foreign Desk, Lisa Daftari. Thanks once again for joining us today from Los Angeles.
My pleasure.